Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Today is May 9th, 2026, and we are here for our monthly genealogy program. I'm Jessica Ashton from the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, and we are here at City Hall in Canyon City. Today's program is Women's Overseas Hospitals, and our presenter, Terri Meeks, will be telling us more about how we can use information about the women's overseas hospitals to dig into our own genealogy research. And I will hand it over to Terri.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. We are going to talk about women's overseas hospitals, especially during World War I. By this time, in the history of many of the wars, disease, which had always been the main cause of death in all wars, disease had come under control. People did still die of disease, but because of better sanitary conditions, vaccinations, blood transfusions, the resulting death tolls were not nearly as great in terms of disease. But we are going to look at the need for these particular hospitals. World War I was a war of unprecedented casualties. 15 to 22 million deaths, both military and civilian, were recorded. Roughly 9.7 million of those were military personnel. And when you include the wounded among both the military and civilian populations, you get up to over 40 million casualties. Most of these casualties occurred in France. That was the center of the war effort. The war was fought on French soil, and the battle lines went back and forth over much of the same territory. Villages were completely bombarded and destroyed. The front was moving constantly back and forth. There was malnutrition. And because much of the war took place in trenches, there were foot diseases, as well as your normal communicable diseases, typhoid, diphtheria, cholera. So there was a desperate need for physicians. The French did not have enough physicians to minister to all of these casualties. The wounded were surrounded by sick, and many of the hospitals catered to both the military and the civilian population. Medical care was indispensable. It was part of the war effort. The French did have medical units, but they needed help. They had between 15 and 20,000 wounded per day. And for the most part, French physicians joined voluntarily. What was medical care like during World War I? It depended on a series of things. What was the geography of the area? Were you in an isolated mountainous area, or were you on flat plains? As we've said, there were trenches. Those were not only protection, but they were obstacles when considering medical care. What was the strategy in the military for the fighting? Medical care also depended on that. The medical care had to move with the troop lines. There were national, social, and economic differences across even the country of France. And of course, the providers. Who were the providers at this particular point in time? There were common goals among the forces. The effort essentially was, we want to get those soldiers that can back into the battlefield. The need for discipline and morale. Those were essentially important across all of the forces. And the recognition of one's specialty in the war, were you were you a sniper? Were you an artillery person? These things, they had value, and that needed to be recognized. In terms of organization of medical units, the first aid was at the front, and they took care of your simple scrapes, scratches, bruises, etc. So behind them was an advanced dressing station, which was still close to the front, but might take care of those that had minor wounds from their combat. Behind that, further back, were field hospitals or casualty clearing stations. These were the areas where triage might have been employed, and those that were more seriously injured were sent on to base hospitals. The field hospitals were the first place that women were seen, and they were usually nurses at this point. It's interesting to note that in the triage process, those that were less severely wounded were taken care of first, because they could be then sent back into combat, whereas those that were very seriously wounded might have come in third place. They were given morphine if it was available before being transferred back to a base hospital. How does the suffrage movement come into this? Well, the movement offered women new opportunities, but these groups, the suffragists, they wanted more opportunities. When we look at the medical care in the nation and the schooling for doctors, only 6% of American doctors were female. If a female actually graduated with a medical degree from a college or university, finding a place to do an internship, a residency, or employment in general was very, very difficult. The hospitals they were male dominated. They didn't want women. So many of the women were forced to take positions in hospitals that had been established by women and were hospitals specifically for women. In 1917, just prior to the U.S. entering World War I, 4 New York women physicians offered their medical services to the military. They were firmly turned down. We don't want your services. The French, however, they were in a desperate situation. Number one, they didn't have the physical structure of hospitals. And number two, they didn't have sufficient physicians or nurses. So they were willing to welcome any woman that wanted to serve in the field. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, they joined forces and they pledged the money, $175,000, to sponsor an all-female team of physicians, nurses, and support personnel to build and staff hospitals in France. And these would be called the Women's Overseas Hospitals Unit. They were actually organized, the women were organized by the New York Infirmary for Women and Children. In February of 1918, this group of women were organized and sent to France to treat the war wounded and help the Allied effort. And they were going to work with, for the most part, they worked with civilians, but also military. And here is a photograph of some of those first women that came in February of 1918. Interestingly, when you look through newspapers for the women's overseas hospitals, you come across articles, and we identify from that previous list, our carpenter was Florence B. Kober. She was assigned originally as a radiographer and a nurse's aide, but because she was so good at bossing the German prisoners around, she actually spoke German, that she became the carpenter. And we'll hear a little bit more about her later. Another article, we find that Miss Anna McNamara, she's the mechanic for this first unit. And Mrs. Helen Griffith, she was assigned as a plumber. So it's interesting that just by searching, you can identify one by one who these actual women were. The suffragist movement would prove that women were just as brave and competent as men. And they hope to prove that by doing this service, that they deserved the right to vote. In the French field, they worked alongside the men in makeshift hospitals. They operated under enemy fire and bombardment. They treated the soldiers as well as the refugees. And influenza, the 1918 outbreak, they had to fight that as well. It is interesting to note that the French soldiers, or the French military doctors, did not appreciate the women initially. So their first assignment had been to build a hospital in Giscard. But by the time the women got there in February of 1918, the Germans had already overrun the position, so they couldn't do that. So of the women that were sent over, 12 were dispatched to a chateau just outside of Paris. There, they treated 650 cases in the first 36 hours that they were present. They worked 16-hour days, and by May, from February to May, the chateau now had 500 beds. In June, the chateau was actually bombed. And here is a picture of the chateau. And in July, in just 18 days, they had performed over 3,000 operations. These four women, Doctors Finley, Edwards, and von Scholey, were surgeons. Dr. Povitsky, she was a pathologist. And all four, along with Nurse Jane McKee, won one of France's highest military honors, the Croix de Guerre. The women were commissioned lieutenants in the French army. And as I said, they were not initially accepted by the French physicians. And it wasn't until they endured that first 36 hours and treated so many cases that they won the respect of the French physicians as well. Here's a brief picture of Miss Jane McKee, who was the nurse during the bombardment of the hospital. Others were sent to build a 50-bed hospital in La Bouillère. The German POWs actually framed the barracks, and here Florence Kober was supervising them. Under French supervision, the German POWs tried to get away with anything that they possibly could, but Florence was a stickler. She spoke German, she understood, and she kept those guys in line. The women, after the framing, the women had to build everything else. There was no running water. There was no electricity. They had to provide all of that on their own. And they even had to build coffins. The hospital grew from 50 to 125 beds, and they treated more than 10,000 refugees. They were funded by the Women's Apparel Association, a completely different organization. Doctors Gregory, Formad, and Seagrave all received the Medal of Valor for their work. Here is a newspaper article for the Fashion Art League of America that is having some kind of a fair where they are selling programs, as well as 2 gowns that will fund the Women's Overseas Hospital. Here's a picture of Dr. Alice Gregory, who was a surgeon. And things were progressively getting worse. The French asked the National American Women's Suffrage Association to send 50 more women doctors, nurses, and assistants. And they set up a 300-bed hospital in Nancy. This hospital was unique. It was set aside specifically to treat victims of gas attacks, those who had had their lungs either injured or destroyed were going to be taken care of in this particular hospital. They also had a mobile unit that would travel to and from the front lines. Dr. Marie Lafort was a specialist in skin diseases. We see a lung specialist, ophthalmologist, as well as 3 other doctors who were surgeons. Anna McNamara, that we mentioned earlier, was the mechanic. She drove a 3-ton mobile unit truck to transport supplies, medical supplies, as well as patients back and forth. She ran a steam engine to heat the water so women could bathe. Here is a picture from September 1918. Mrs. Raymond Brown, she was the vice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In the lower left is Dr. Ada McMahon, and in the right, Dr. Mary Louise Lafort. And we see from a school yearbook from the University of Minnesota, we see Dr. Barsness, and she was the ophthalmologist in this particular unit. We also have a September 21st Fargo, North Dakota forum, and we see the staff list. We see the medical doctor Marie-Louise Lafort, a specialist in skin diseases, Dr. Ada McMahon, a surgeon, Dr. Irene Morse, Dr. Elizabeth Bryan, Flood, Stella Fuchs, probably a nurse, Mrs. Anna Ellis, another nurse, Mrs. Edith Lacey. We see all of these, and Clara Paquette, so a senior clerk. So through, we can see some of the women that actually participated in this. So if one of your family members happened to be a woman involved in World War I, they might be found in one of these hospital units. There were also clinics and other medical organizations that were set up in order to minister to the wounded and the refugees. Here are 3 more doctors that served in clinics. And we have a passport application for Dr. Aba Detterer. It's an emergency passport application. She wants to visit her sick sister in Sweden. And later we do find her returning to the United States in December of 1919. And she is coming from Norway. So not only were there the American women's overseas hospitals, there were American Women's Hospital Service. And in 1917, a committee was established. And the first thing I wanted to do was to realize how many women were involved in the medical field, whether they were doctors, nurses, or other types of practitioners. They wanted a complete census so they knew how many women there were and how could they be applied as resources to the war effort. Not only did women serve overseas, women did serve here in the United States as well in these efforts, organizing on the home front for medical supplies to be shipped to these hospitals, etc. So they adopted the name American Women's Hospitals, and they would provide care for the civilian population overseas, and they would establish military hospitals overseas. They worked in conjunction with the Red Cross and another organization that we'll see in a second, the American Committee for Devastated France. They set up hospitals and treatment centers, and ultimately they sent 128 women physicians abroad by 1920. They sent doctors, technicians, lay workers, and it wasn't only to France, it was to other areas where war was being conducted. Here is a picture, an entrance to American Women's Hospitals. They obviously are in a chateau area. So they have commandeered whatever building is available for them to set up to take care of the population. Here are some of the doctors, nurses, and chauffeurs that were at the American Women's Hospitals. And someone thankfully identified each of the people. In July of 1918, that's when they established their first hospital at Neufmoutier-en-Brie. It had 25 beds and a staff of 15 women, and they included dentists, We will see dentists throughout each one of these hospitals. Later, they moved to Luzancy, where they set up another unit to take care of refugees. The organization that began as the American Women's Hospital Service still exists today and does still provide global medical aid, hospital support, as well as personnel support. And as part of this unit, these women were there. When you see the parentheses with photo or obituary, that's where they get the information that they actually served in this particular unit. This is Dr. Louise Hurl, and she was the director for the American Women's Hospitals. There were also contract surgeons. The US military would not accept women in the medical corps, but they could serve as contract surgeons. They were civilians. They were considered civilians. They worked for the Army Medical Department, and they worked side by side with US military personnel. They were paid a lower salary. They did not have any military rank or any benefits. And 56 women physicians became contractees. 11 of those were actually assigned overseas, the majority as anesthetists. The remaining 45 served stateside. There were elaborate regulations for these women. The government paid for their transportation, their quarters, and as if they were first lieutenants, they also got heat and light. But there was no additional pay for overseas service. The maximum that they were allowed per contract was $1,800 a year, and the amount that they actually received was by agreement in the contract. Their immediate supervisors were the commissioned officers of the US military. As we've seen in some of the previous pictures, this is what the uniforms look like for these women. And we see this list of contract surgeons. Those with France in parentheses are the ones that actually served overseas, the others stateside. Here is Dr. Esther Leonard's physician contract, and it outlines, as I've previously mentioned, that she is going to get quarters, she will have electricity, etc., but it's going to be under a certain structure. The American Red Cross also staffed hospitals and provided ambulance services for both the armed forces and civilian communities. They organized the formation of base hospitals. They helped to staff these hospitals, and they established actually 54 hospitals overseas. And they had sent 11 commissioned units to Europe. And here are some of the doctors that served under the Red Cross. So we're seeing a lot of women. In Morton, Maryland, there is a historical marker for the childhood home of Rosalie Slaughter. She was a surgeon and public health advocate. She was known for the public health work that she did, and she not only did she serve in France, she established the International Serbian Education Committee in 1919, and she received decorations for distinguished service from both governments, France and Serbia. Here is an extended portion of the passport application for Dr. Olga Statsy. It's really interesting when you look for these women's passport applications that there are additional pages. There's not only the application, there are handwritten pages, there are advocacy statements, there are other forms of information that are listed, not just the passport. Here she is I think, yeah, she just states that she wants to serve in France with the American Expeditionary Forces or a relief hospital. The American Fund for French Wounded. This was organized by American women that were actually living overseas. And it was formed in Paris in the fall of 1915, as soon as the war broke out in 1914. Isabel Stevens Lathrop was the founder and president. Anne Morgan, the daughter of financier J.P. Morgan, she was the UA-based treasurer. And the whole point of this organization was to raise money to provide relief for the wounded. Ann Dyke was the chair of the Civilian Committee, and we'll see what that group did. They raised money to provide medical supplies, dressings, blankets, clothing, and food, amusement. And many women on the United States front actually worked in their homes. There was a whole knitting movement to make clothing, sweaters, etc., for the men overseas. We've often seen movies where women are making dressings for the wounded. This is the organization that provided the money for those efforts. The volunteers on the Civilian Committee actually lived in France in villages. And these are women, they made structural repairs, they replanted fields, and they delivered the provisions that were sent overseas. They ran a women's volunteer motor corps out of Paris. They created temporary depots in villages, and their drivers would perform their own maintenance work. These were not ambulance drivers, but these were volunteer drivers who would ferry all of these supplies, etc., back and forth to the hospitals. Here's a poster from the United States for the American Fund for French Wounded. One of their buildings in France. And we see a group of the drivers from 1918. Other women's groups sent female physicians to Europe. Bellevue Hospital, Presbyterian Hospital, American Ambulance Hospital, American Medical Women's Association. Each one of them, these organizations, sent at least one, if not more, women into the field. Here is a picture from Find a Grave of Dr. Esther Lovejoy. We see her in her uniform. Wellesley College sent 4 units of women. The American Committee for Devastated France, our Dr. Olga Olga Statsny, whose passport application we saw earlier. The armistice was signed in 1918, but that didn't end the need for medical care. Men, soldiers, were returning home. Women and children who had evacuated when their town was overrun and moved to seek shelter with family in other areas, they were returning. They were returning to devastated areas. They had not been able to plant anything during the war effort, so food was scarce. And so members of these various organizations stayed for months afterwards. The war ended in 1918. Some of these women were still in the field in 1920. They helped with restoration. They helped to maintain the hospitals. And these hospitals that they had built were eventually turned over to the French government. Here is an article from April 5th of 1919 for the hospitals being presented to the Army of France. In all, during just the really short period of time, mostly late 1917, early 1918 through the end of 1918, 25,000 Americans actually worked during the war to support the Allied efforts. This was huge. More than 100 were decorated by foreign governments, and not a single one of them was recognized by the US government for her service. So where to find a lot of this information? The American Women's Hospital Service still exists today. They have a website. They are still providing hospitals and medical care throughout the world. So newspapers are a key source of information here. Ancestry, for the most part, passport applications. I don't know why I included military records, because these women were not recognized as part of the military. Some of the military contracts might have been included under military records. Obituaries, whether it be on Find a Grave or through newspapers. And many books, several books, have been written about these women and their service overseas. So let's see what can be found. Here's the Hollow, Montana news, and we're talking about the Women's Mobile Hospital Unit and Dr. Caroline Finley. Here is one of those passport applications for Dr. Anna von Scholey, and she's heading to France to work in an overseas hospital. You can see down in this area. Always turn over to page 2, and we get a picture of Dr. von Scholey. This is one of those continuation letters. She had a passport, and she wishes to extend her service and continue her work at Chateau Angnon. So she's asking for an extension of her passport. And we see a card where she actually was honored with a conspicuous service cross from the French government. In very, very small print at the bottom, we see Dr. Frances Haynes. She is a contract surgeon. And in May of 1918, she is going aboard the Justicia, sailing from New York to France. And in March of 1919, she is returning to the United States. She is listed again as a contract surgeon, but she's in Base Hospital 13. And you will note all these other women, these civilians, as well as the, I believe it's the Army Nurse Corps, the ANC. They are all serving with her in these overseas hospitals. So some of these ship lists will give you clues about your potential relative that might have served overseas. Oops. We see Dr. Caroline Finley in 1930. She has come home from the war and she is a physician and has established her own practice. And we see her find a grave. We see both a picture of her in uniform, a picture of her actually working, and a brief biography of her and the work that she did in the overseas hospitals. A New York Tribune article that acknowledges Dr. Olga Povitsky, the pathologist. She had worked for the New York City Board of Health prior to going in, and has qualified as a gas expert through study at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And we see her when in 1930, when she has returned to the United States and still is working with the New York City Health Department as a physician. She's also living at the American Women's Association Club Hotel. So many of the other women that might be listed here also might have served in that organization. Miss Pulpas, a graduate of Berkeley University, went out with the first unit to France, and she is a nurse. Fanny Marion Gregory was the sister of Dr. Alice Gregory, who was in charge of Unit 1 Hospital. She was actually an entertainer, and she went over number one independently and also as a Red Cross volunteer to entertain the troops. She sailed to France in 1917 to assist Alice and Dr. Caroline Finley in their work with refugee women and children. Both sisters, the doctor as well as the entertainer, contracted tuberculosis, and Marion actually died 5 years later in 1923. And we see Miss Bertha Bernstein, and she is one of the ones who established the Women's Apparel Unit, which funded the Women's Overseas Hospital. So there are all the women that are behind the scenes as well as these surgeons and physicians. Unfortunately, 2 women did succumb to the 1918 fluenza epidemic, Winifred Warder and Miss Eva Emmons tragically died during their service. And we see Anne Curry, who is a correspondent, and she is talking about the work of Dr. Marie Formad, who's a surgeon, and Dr. Nevin, who is a dentist. And this is from 1918 when they first arrived. Dr. Nevin has drawn her first tooth. And once again, we see this is the gas hospital staff that is talked about in this particular article. Doctors as well as nurses. And we see the gas unit, some photographs of the women, as well as a brief little article about them. The Washington Times, these are the women that moved on to Luzon-C. Dr. Olda Statsny from Nebraska. Dr. Ward from Denver. Dr. Deanne Kinney, a dentist. Miss Clark, who goes over as a nurse, and Miss Caldwell, a former Red Cross chauffeuse. So women from Colorado as well. Here are French and Serbian tots that are being doctored in the hospital, the American Women's Hospital. And we see the 22 women are receiving honors from the French government. And we see a listing of some of their names at the bottom. Dr. Charlotte, I want to say Finley, but no. Charlotte Fairbanks. She performed 93 surgeries in a month. She is one of the ones that recognized the need for doctors, nurses, ambulances, and medical equipment actually in Serbia. And she moved on from her work in France to serve in Serbia. And we see where she was honored and became a citizen of France and received the gold medal from Luzon-C. We have a repeat article, Dr. Louise Hurl, who was chief of this particular unit, and the other surgeons and staff. We just saw Charlotte Fairbanks, and we're seeing Dr. Doherty, a dentist, Dr. Mary Evans, the laboratory, Dr. J. Manwaring, Dr. Mary McClellan, house physician, Dr. Frazier from Denver, and Dr. Inez Bentley, superintendent. Here is the 1930 census, and we see both Simon and Kate Carpez. Both are physicians. He was a surgeon in the military in the field in France, and she was an internist who actually volunteered and went to France. And here is her military, her burial at Arlington National Cemetery. He was buried there first. She was buried along with him. The records at the bottom, it indicates the records also show that this officer's wife, Dr. Kate Bogle Carpeles of Washington, D.C., entered into a contract with the Surgeon General and discharged the duties of a contract surgeon. And she served with the U.S. Army on reported on March 9th of 1918. The contract was honorably terminated by reason of annulment in June of the following year. She had fulfilled her service contract. We see an article about the refugee needs. The armistice has been signed, but the women are the French Army of Occupation. They are moving backwards. They're moving the German forces backwards, and they are halted at Mest by the great number of Allied prisoners needing attention. So they set up a hospital of 150 beds for influenza victims, and they were then sent to Cambrai to care for the refugees. Dr. Finley was one of those who served in this area. If a Warren Medal, why not a ballot? It points out that these medal winners, these medal honorees, they served in harrowing conditions, and that they proved themselves. They were equal to men, and they deserve to have the right to vote. It would be a whole nother year before that came about. Here is an October 1917 passport application for Marion Gregory. She was the one that was the entertainer. She also, in this particular passport application, she says she's the Paris agent for the Women's Hospital Unit for Foreign Service, and she's going to sail on the España in November of 1917. Here is her sister's passport application, Dr. Alice Gregory, a physician, and she is going to do hospital work in France. She too is sailing on the España, the same ship, but 3 months later. And here is the España. As I mentioned, there are numerous reports, books, and other paperwork that you can investigate to find out about these various hospitals and the organizations that sponsored them. The women that worked here on the state side to support these women, either doing rolling bandages, knitting sweaters, fundraising, all of that work was significant and made it possible for these hospitals and these 25,000 women to be fielded and supported in the war. Here is a report from the hospital. Here is one of the books, Bellevue in France. Anne Chamland was actually sent by Bellevue Hospital in New York to France, thus the title. The House of a Good Neighbor by Esther Paul Lovejoy. She was one of the surgeons in France. A Doctor's Holiday in Iran, Rosalie Slaughter. She was the woman that we saw from Morton, Maryland, who had the historical marker for her home. She's the one that also worked to establish hospitals in Serbia and later on, apparently, in Iran. Dr. Lovejoy also wrote a couple of books about her experiences during the war. So with that, we will conclude today our presentation on the Women's Overseas Hospital. And as we've seen, there were more than just the Women's Overseas Hospitals. There were several other organizations and hospital units that were set up throughout France as well as in other countries. So don't hesitate to look for your particular ancestor and what their women's role might have been during World War I.
All right. Well, thank you, Terri. That was so interesting. I learned a lot and I was really surprised. I didn't realize that women had such roles as doctors and the labor and trades. It was really, really interesting to hear about back in, that World War I era, especially. So yeah, moving on here, we do have this afternoon our first tavern talk of the year. I know some of you may have been enrolled in it. It won't be the only one, so there'll be more coming up. But today's tavern talk is on Skyline Drive, Canyon City's Almost Boulevard, and this is part of our series of tavern talks to celebrate America's 250-year anniversary, Colorado's 150-year anniversary. So keep an eye on our website, canyonsity.gov/museum. And on our calendar there, you can see the upcoming events. Also the Royal Gorge Chamber Alliance, Fremont 360, all those calendars have all the upcoming events. And we also have a new exhibit up at the museum, 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard, Moments That Made Us. And it is also commemorating both of those historic anniversaries. So thank you, and we hope to see you next month.